Finally, staff will be monitoring the chat box throughout the meeting. So if you're having any technical issues or want to let us know that you want to make a comment, please use that chat box. Moving on to agenda changes and announcements. Staff has no changes or announcements to make. Does any member of the committee wish to propose any changes or make any announcements today? All right, seeing or hearing none, let's move on to our next item. We have before us the draft minutes of November 3rd, 2022. Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? All right, seeing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
Mayor Rockingham, I'll approve. Make the motion.
I'll second it. Kevin O'Malley.
Thank you, Kevin. Is there any discussion regarding the minutes? All right, if not, Sarah, can you call the roll of the voting members, please?
Yes, Dan Burke.
Grant Davis, aye.
Oh, yes, my apologies. Kevin O'Malley.
Yes.
Jeff Shriver.
Yes.
President Gallagher.
Yes.
Mayor Rockingham.
Aye.
Do we have Mayor Schilke online? No. All right, Kama Dobbs.
Yes.
All right.
All right, thank you, Sarah. The motion carries. All right, included in your packet today, just for information, is the final draft application booklet that the committee approved in November without the strike-through underline formatting. The draft will continue to be in the title until all of the application material references and links are updated by staff. Within this final draft is the proposed schedule for the call for project cycle. It is on page 53, which is the third from the last of the final booklet, and also here on our screens. As shown, the call for projects will open on January 17th and close on March 10th. As we've done in the past, we're setting a soft deadline on February 24th for planning liaisons at our councils and for Grant at the City of Chicago to provide a first review of applications for completeness and to give those liaisons time to provide feedback to applicants on any changes that may be needed before final submittals. 3 weeks after the call closes, staff will provide a list of eligible projects to the councils and CDOT for their use in assigning sub-regional priority points. This eligibility determination will be based on meeting the overall requirements for total cost and/or the number of sponsors, as well as inclusion in plans, but it will not include the elimination of any projects that don't meet the minimum need or improvement thresholds. We won't be far enough in the scoring to have made that determination yet. Councils and CDOT can request travel shed maps for individual projects on this list to aid them in assigning priority points at that time. A summary of applications will also be available for the committee's April meeting. As in the past, this summary will be the statistical summary of the applications, who were the sponsors, what are the project types, things like that. By April 21st, councils and CDOT will need to submit their sub-regional priorities so that those can be added to the total scores. As described in the sub-regional priority section of the methodology, the priorities will be shared with all, and if anyone would like additional justification for any of the projects selected, there is time built into the schedule, including a tentative meeting date for this committee in May. Once all sub-regional priority points are finalized, staff will release evaluation and scoring results to applicants, and time will be given to those applicants in May or June for review of those scores, just to be sure that we didn't misinterpret any applications. Staff will present a recommended program to this committee on July 13th to start the public comment period, which will close on August 11th. A summary of comments received and any changes to the recommended program will be presented to the committee on August 31st. Following committee approval, tip changes will be made to reflect the approved program, and those will be presented to the CMAP Transportation Committee in September for their recommendation to the MPO Policy Committee and CMAP Board for the October 11th joint meeting. Are there any questions or concerns about the proposed schedule? Not looking for action today, but if there are questions or concerns, we can address those. All right, we'll move on to our next agenda And I see in the chat, staff has alerted me that the recording didn't get started prior to the roll call. So just for the record, we have present today myself chairing the meeting representing CMAP, Jeff Shriver representing CDOT, Kevin O'Malley representing CDOT, and Grant Davis representing CDOT, as well as Mayor Rockingham representing the Council of Mayors, and President Gallagher also representing the Council of Mayors. Our non-voting members that are present include John Donovan from Federal Highway, Heather Mullins from the RTA, Sis Killen representing our counties, and Tony Grief representing the FTA. So just wanted to get that into the recording for the record. So next on our agenda today is an action item where staff is proposing revisions to our active program management policies. Just to be clear, the intent of active program management remains the same, and that's to take actions for individual projects and the overall programs that will help the region to obligate all of the STP funding that we are allotted each year, and to ensure that we are accelerating projects that are ready to go and providing opportunities for projects experiencing delays to take the time necessary to resolve those delays. There are, of course, a lot of moving parts to project implementation. And when we consider that there are hundreds, over 500 currently in the TIP, of STP funded projects that are being implemented under 13 different programs, the need to stay informed about the progress of projects are making and to do so in a consistent manner is crucial to maximizing our obligations. When we enacted our current policies 4 years ago, several of the strategies were really just ideas born from our individual and collective experiences with federally funded projects. Over these first 4 years of implementing the policies, we've learned some new things and have made some small adjustments along the way, and that's what's reflected in the revisions proposed today. So starting with the simple stuff, just to add clarity and make it easier to reference specific policies when there are questions, the format of the entire document has been revised into an outline style with all of the major points numbered for referencing. We've also added cross-referencing to help tie the policies together better, and have added definitions of key terms used throughout the policies. Finally, we've regrouped and better defined what are sponsor responsibilities, what are selecting body responsibilities, and what are CMAP staff responsibilities. We've also made some language updates, adding a section discussing the relationship of the Section 1440 process to obligations, and acknowledging that with legislation passed earlier this year, there's some uncertainty with GATA requirements. We've also clarified what an obligation is, when it occurs, what actions have to happen before it can occur, and what the usual timelines are for those actions. Finally, in part because we have 13 different bodies that operate in 13 different ways, more specific language has been added on transparency, public participation, and record keeping. Quarterly status updates are one of the most important tools we have for actively managing our programs. Therefore, the policies now contain more detailed descriptions of the format of those updates and how to submit them, including when it is appropriate to skip sections of the update, like when a project's already received design approval, it isn't necessary to provide updates on pre-engineering activities. Although our update form calls for providing certain attachments, like copies of major action approvals, the policies now specifically call attention to this. The policies also spell out that estimated dates are for actions that haven't happened yet and therefore should be in the past, and that completed date, or therefore should be in the future, sorry, and that completed dates should be in the past. Finally, there's no changes to the policies for withdrawing funding if updates aren't completed, but those policies have been spelled out a little more clearly. Accounting for all of the programming, reprogramming, obligations, and transfers of funding is a major part of managing our STP programs. All of the elements of this accounting have been more fully described within the policies, including how and when adjustments get made within the accounting. Since early in our implementation of active program management, we've referred to funds that are removed from individual selecting body marks at the end of the fiscal year as redistribution. However, our original policy document did use the term shared fund for those funds, which was confusing and often was misinterpreted as the shared fund. So the policy revisions fix this by using the term redistribution throughout. The policies in the regional accounting section also describe when and what funds get transferred to redistribution and provide more specific instructions for when bodies are eligible and how to use that redistribution. New policies have also been added to allow bodies to plan to use redistribution, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. At the top of this agenda item, I did note that we have learned some things as we've been implementing our active program management policies, and it's always been the practice of this body to take the lessons that we learn and adjust our practices to those lessons. So 3 of the major things that we've learned about active program management are that while imposing obligation deadlines on projects absolutely makes sense, project sponsors sometimes really need to have their feet held to the fire in order to make progress. The lag times that we do experience on the steps leading up to obligation can really complicate the application of our obligation deadlines. So while we know we should be withdrawing funding from projects on September 30th, if paperwork for those projects is already in, the system turns on and that paperwork eventually emerges on the other side approved. And so withdrawing the funding actually had no effect. And thus far, our selecting bodies have not really enforced the withdrawals and have instead scrambled to add withdrawn projects back into their programs when this happens. A second thing that we've learned is that it doesn't matter when a cost increase is approved, but 99% of the time, we're seeing that if funding was already obligated for a phase before the increase was included, the state will not request authorization for the increase from federal highway until the already authorized funding has been invoiced and reimbursed. Finally, we've learned that even though there are policies in place to actively reprogram and clear advantages for doing so, sponsors are extremely reluctant to accept a change to their program federal fiscal year. So based on these lessons, there are some more substantial proposed changes to our policies today. Kind of taking the responses to the lessons in reversed order. Over these first 4 years, we've observed that even though active reprogramming is both allowed and encouraged, some sponsors and really even entire councils are reluctant to use it. In some instances, sponsors seem wary of any change to the programmed status of their projects, including just changes to the federal fiscal year. Also, several selecting bodies are very reluctant to move projects around, even though doing so could allow them a much better chance for reaching 100% obligation, and thus also being able to use the redistribution. So to help nudge folks to use the reprogramming a little bit more aggressively, policies have been added to require reprogramming in 2 instances. First, if another sponsor requests reprogramming, for example, they're programmed in federal fiscal year 25 and they're ready to go, they've met all their milestones and they want to be moved into federal fiscal year 23, that request cannot be denied now by the selecting body if there is sufficient unprogrammed balance to accommodate it. So we don't want to hold back projects that are ready and have met their milestones just because other things are programmed, or if nothing is programmed. Likewise, if there are project phases in that year that are targeting an obligation before the end of the year, so are already planning to miss their obligation deadline, selecting bodies will now be required to actively move that project targeting the later date out of the program in order to accommodate a project that is ready to move into the program. So just small nudges here. To account for the second lesson that we learned, that requests for additional authorizations won't be made until already authorized funds are expended, policies for when cost changes will be approved and what year they should be approved in were added. The specifics vary a little bit by the phase and whether the project is being processed by IDOT or FTA, and are really based on the timing of the request relative to the submittal of funding agreements or relative to an FTA transfer request, as well as the authorization of previously programmed funds. So generally speaking, if agreements haven't been submitted or the transfer request to the FTA hasn't been made, then cost increases can be approved right away, added to the already programmed funds. If those submittals have already been made, then based on what the phase is and what today's date is when that cost increase is made, those can be approved and be programmed either in the current year if it's appropriate, or in the first out year if that's appropriate. So I think we've seen a lot of programming of cost increases in the current year, and those increases are not they have no chance of being obligated within the current year. So we want to make sure there's flexibility to approve those in an out year rather than the current year. Also, if originally programmed funds have already been authorized, we want to look at what's the percentage of those funds that have been expended. And again, program that cost increase in the year that's appropriate to when it's likely to be obligated. To address the complications with withdrawing funds after paperwork is submitted, some modifications to the obligation deadline policies are proposed. First, there's no change to the actual deadline being the last day of the federal fiscal year, and no change to the provision for a one-time 6-month extension. However, there are new minimum requirements proposed that must be met to be considered for an extension, as well as a second set of requirements to be able to be approved for that extension. If the approval requirements aren't met by the end of the fiscal year deadline, then any approved extension would be revoked. But what is new is that the extension policies apply to the carryover of the funds for 6 months, not the carryover of the project itself. So project phases need to be able to continue in programs, even if the obligation deadline is missed. Only projects that would be removed are those that did not obligate their funds and didn't request an extension, or did request an extension but didn't meet minimum requirements. Let me go more detail on this. So again, looking at this on a phase-by-phase basis and type of processing, for projects processed through FTA, in order to be considered for a deadline extension, regardless of what the phase was, sponsors would need to show that the NEPA process and all project development / pre-engineering work is completed. For those projects processed through IDOT, based on the phase, the minimum requirements are a little bit different. And again, these are all related to what it takes for funding to actually get authorized. So for phase 1 engineering to be considered for an extension, the qualifications-based selection process, or QBS, needs to be completed. If phase 1 engineering were going to be done in-house, there is no QBS, and so those projects would automatically meet the minimum requirement. So for phase 2, the QBS needs to be completed and the project must have phase 1 design approval. Likewise, for land acquisition, design approval is also needed, and plans and legals need to be done. For construction, the project needs to be on target for at least the April letting. For line items that are programmed for cost increases or supplemental funds, the original funding authorization can't still be in advanced construction, and federal highway reimbursement of expenditures must have started. So if an extension request was approved based on the above, then by the end of the federal fiscal year, September 30th, each phase would need to go just that one step further to show that they were ready to be extended, which means they need to have their draft agreement submitted, or for construction still be on track for a letting prior to April. For cost increases, we would be looking at least 75% of already obligated funds being expended. So again, setting folks up to actually be able to be obligated. Other proposed changes related to obligation deadlines include policies for selecting bodies to follow when considering approval of requests. So including stating clearly that extensions cannot be approved if quarterly updates are missing, or if those minimum requirements that I just talked about haven't been met. If any phases are carried forward but don't qualify to have the funding carry forward, selecting bodies will be able to plan to use redistribution to offset that funding deficit. So the last change proposed removes the additional 3-month extension from our previous policies and instead allows projects to remain in the program, but the funds for the projects that missed extended deadlines would be removed from the mark, which means for these projects to remain programmed, some other project may need to be removed. This removal cannot be offset with planned use of redistribution, and projects that would miss an extended deadline would not be eligible to use redistribution funds. So this shift in policy really gives councils the flexibility to continue to carry forward lagging projects, knowing that the consequence of doing so is a reduction of the council's programming marks, but that if, if the council still spends all of their money, obligates all of their money, then they can, access or get those marks back through the use of redistribution. So what exactly is planned use of redistribution? Knowing that we do all try to fully program our marks, it's understood that carrying forward projects to the next fiscal year without the funding associated with those projects is likely to mean that we would be over-programmed. But because our goal is to obligate as much funding as we possibly can, and because projects need to be in the TIP in the current year in order to be obligated, each selecting body will be allowed to assume at the beginning of the year that they are going to achieve 100% obligation and will therefore need to use redistribution funds at some time. The maximum amount of redistribution that can be planned to be used would be equal to that amount that was programmed in the prior year for those phases that met the requirements of an extension but did not meet the milestones to actually receive that extension. There's no change to the policies that redistribution can only be used after the body has obligated 100% of their funds. So really two things will affect the amount of redistribution that can be programmed. First, any unprogrammed balance of funds would need to be programmed prior to planning to use redistribution. So you can't hold on to a balance and plan to use the regional balance. The second one is if at any point during the year, that the target authorization for any program phases beyond the last day of the year, then the planned use of redistribution would no longer be allowed, because if you have a target date that's beyond the last day of the year, that means you're not going to reach 100% obligation. So again, you can't plan to use those additional funds. The planned use of redistribution should always be programmed on project phases that are targeting the latest authorization dates in the year. You're not going to use redistribution until after you've obligated 100% of your funding, so it makes sense to program it on those projects targeting later dates. And we need to keep track of this planned use. So it will be shown in the regional accounting reports, and it will be required to be reflected in the selecting body's programs, as well as in the TIP. In the TIP, we'll program that as the STP shared fund, because those funds are constrained at the regional level rather than the local level. And, as bodies use up their STP local funding, that will then switch that fund source in the TIP. Throughout the year, the actual redistribution will not be restricted. So, even though we're going to plan to use redistribution, if somebody actually qualifies to use redistribution, they're not going to be held back from using that just because others were planning to. So there is a little bit of risk to this planned use of redistribution, because those funds aren't guaranteed to be there at the end of the year. But what we've seen so far is that there's so much shifting of projects that we're just not reaching 100% obligation as a region. I'm clearly talking too much if I'm starting to cough here. So we're almost through this, and then we'll start discussion. The last major policy change that is proposed is to adjust the program development schedule a little bit. So our original policies 4 years ago laid out a common schedule for program development, and that really has provided more certainty and uniform expectations for our project sponsors. However, the schedule we're on does have a couple of downsides to it. By wrapping up our program development in the fall, we've been running into conflicting TIP changes when we're trying to close out the past federal fiscal year while also trying to add new project phases into the TIP. Also because the MPO Policy Committee meets a couple weeks into October, which is a couple weeks after the start of the federal fiscal year. And then after that approval, we need to wait for other approvals, such as IDOT approving the use of toll credits, for example. We wind up, in the situation where new project phases that were added in that first federal fiscal year of the program are already a few weeks, if not even months behind in trying to reach their obligation deadline. So to mitigate these conflicts, staff is proposing, as part of the policy changes, to shift our program development cycles forward by 4 months so that the final tip change approvals are occurring at the June meeting of the MPO Policy Committee instead of the October meeting. This shift is proposed to start with the next local programming cycle. So instead of holding calls for projects starting in January 2024, those calls could open as soon as October of 2023. We did talk with the planning liaisons about this a little bit on Monday, and there are some concerns that local sponsors have been taking steps like starting their preliminary engineering to align with the expected call for projects in January 2024, and shifting that forward to October 2023 could make it difficult for them to be ready, or in some methodologies could actually eliminate projects from consideration. So what was requested was some flexibility for that next local call cycle. And staff really thinks that as long as program development can be completed in time for the tip change cycle preceding the June MPO Policy Committee, and that as long as there is at least 30 days for public comment on proposed programs, then the councils and CDOT could adjust the start and end dates of their calls to mitigate those potential impacts from shifting the schedule kind of suddenly. So for the shared fund, the call that we're about to start, our fiscal year 24 to 28 cycle, would remain on the current January to March call cycle, with approvals scheduled for October. And then the shift forward will be planned for our next call cycle for the 26 to 2030 cycle, which would open then in October of 2024 instead of January of 2025. It's also pretty likely that if we shift the shared funds cycle, that we would also shift the CMAQ and TAP cycles with that. So, and I think several years ago, long before STP was started, CMAQ and TAP were on that cycle. So that may be a shift back for them. I know that was a lot. So just want to summarize, staff is seeking approval of the proposed updates to the active program management policies, and those include format and language updates, more details about quarterly status update requirements, an explanation of regional accounting, some requirements to reprogram, guidelines for programming cost changes in the federal fiscal year that make sense, changes to obligation deadlines and extensions that allow projects to continue even if their funding is removed, a mechanism to plan for the use of funds that were transferred to redistribution, and a shifting of the program development schedule. So I'm going to drink some water and ask if there are questions or comments, concerns, suggestions for additional updates from members of the committee. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, hi, Kim. Thank you so much. Very thorough presentation on this. And so let me just sort of ask up front, because I know we received the document, I think, earlier this week, and now we're seeing this detailed presentation. Before I get into the questions, or have basically, let me confess something. Like, I don't spend my day to day on these nuances, and I don't want to speak for the mayors. I assume none of us do, except for maybe Grant Davis. And so, before I unleash his questions, what you want to vote on this today? Is there any deadline reason? I mean, could we all sort of just agree to sort of say, hey, let's do informational today, and then have a conversation now, maybe give a couple weeks of more talk? I mean, what's the schedule purpose on this to vote today?
So,
yeah.
Honestly, ideally, trying to get it wrapped up by the end of the year, and making sure that, we have the policies in place before our call for projects closes, so that folks that apply for the shared fund understand what they're committing to by applying. So that really gives us until March. If you look ahead a couple of agenda items talking about our calendar for 2023, I did note that we only need to meet in February if we need to continue this active program management discussion. So there is definitely wiggle room to continue, just have a conversation today and not take a vote until February. But we have to put on the agenda the potential for a vote. So that's what's listed on the agenda, but it is certainly within the committee's purview to say we want to have the discussion today and come back and take our final vote in February.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's our preference, just because when we see redistribution, it's such a important thing to make sure we get right, and all that. But that's the city's position. But I don't want to not have the conversation today. I just wanted to sort of throw that out there. It seemed like, because we got this on Monday, I think. So that would be our preference.
Yeah. So I would say let's go ahead and take questions, comments, concerns, and suggestions, and then we'll look to postpone action today and schedule that action for February. President Gallagher, looks like you've got a question.
Well, Kama, I just wanted to say thank you too. I wanted to echo the comments. I really appreciate that thorough summary, and I do agree with delaying the vote until we all have a chance to digest this. I was wondering if you could possibly send that summary that you just went through at great personal expense to the committee members.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll distribute that also to all of the planning liaisons so that it's available for full council review as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I see Mayor Rockingham unmuted.
Yeah, I just want to say the same thing, very detailed. I know there's a lot of, changes or that have been added or changed to it. At a first blush, I don't see too many, things that would have to be, possibly discussed. But yeah, I do think that it, to make the vote, at the next meeting would probably be more appropriate. That way, a lot of the liaisons can, look at it and give their comments also. But other than that, I think it excellent report there.
Thank you, Mayor. Other comments and questions? I think Grant, Kevin kind of implied that you had some questions. if you want to,
I agree with Kevin that I think it's important that we have an opportunity to digest this. I've mentioned this before. There's like this. I totally understand the wanting to spend down the obligation, but that's competing with making sure that projects are good projects. We can spend down everything if we just do mill and fill. You don't have to go through IDOT at all, for the most part. But if you want to start implementing stuff that CMAP and this committee wants to implement, it just adds on a lot of challenges with it. And a lot of them are unexpected challenges that can arise at any time and delay a project by 18 months or more, just due to what kind of curveballs that are thrown out there. So I would agree that I think it's important that we kind of digest it. We'll probably come back to you with questions or discussions and then, vote on it at the next meeting. But I understand where you guys are coming from. I should say that. So, thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, we've seen the types of delays you're talking about where, something comes up last minute, you have to react to that. And, that means an obligation deadline is missed. Well, that project is still making progress and moving forward. And so really the proposed changes today are to say, well, if you want to continue to carry forward that project, you should. And, be flexible in your programming to be able to do that. So, the changes here really are intended to improve the flexibility, but also, making sure that if there's a pause on a project that, we're not holding those funds back from other projects that are ready. So, it's a balance for sure. And we are learning as we go. So that's, part of why we're making the revision suggestions now that we are. I would expect that if this committee does approve these in February, again, we'll continue to take a look at it after every cycle, both local and shared fund cycles, and continue to tweak over the years as we need to. So, appreciate the comments and appreciate you digging into it. And if there's specific questions that we can talk about offline and then present those conversations to the committee in February. We can do that. Other comments or questions from members of the committee, including our advisory members? Is there anyone in the audience today that wanted to comment or ask a question on this? This committee is always wants to hear from those in attendance. So. Don't see anyone unmuting, so I'm going to assume that means that nobody else has anything to say about this today, particularly knowing that we've got a couple of months now to digest and form some questions. So we will go ahead and postpone our action item to February. That will be on the agenda, and go ahead and move on to our next item then. Which is our meeting dates. So this is approval for our 2023 meeting calendar. Those proposed meeting dates are shown here. 3 of those proposed dates are shown as if needed, including that first February 9th meeting. So was holding that meeting time precisely for what just happened. If we needed to go ahead and further the discussion about active program management. So let's go ahead and plan on having that meeting. The other 2 that are noted as if needed is May 18th, and that is a meeting that actually doesn't align with CMAQ and TAP. That was being held just in case we need to discuss the sub-regional priority points. So the methodology changes that we approved last month included provisions for a committee discussion if we didn't come to staff level agreement on sub-regional priority points. So want to hold that meeting in May for that if needed. And then November 30th, what would be the last meeting of the year, because we're in a project selection cycle, we probably don't need to have that meeting, but would like to hold it on calendars just in case. Otherwise, all of the meetings as usual are scheduled for Thursday mornings at 9:30, and there are CMAQ and TAP meetings scheduled the same days as well, assuming that committee approves later this afternoon. So before I ask for a motion to approve the calendar, are there any questions or concerns about any of these dates? If not, I'll take a motion to approve this meeting calendar for 2023.
I'll make that motion, Kama.
Thank you,
Alice
President.
Gallagher.
Is there a second?
I'll second it, Mayor Rockingham.
Thank you, Mayor. Any discussion? If not, Sarah, could you call the roll?
All right, Grant Davis,
Yes.
Kevin O'Malley,
Yes.
Jeff Shriver,
Yes.
President Gallagher,
Yes.
Mayor Rockingham.
Aye.
Do we have Mayor Schilke? All right, and Kama Dobbs.
Yes. All right, we now have a 2023 meeting calendar. Staff will send out Outlook calendar reminders before the end of the year so that those get held on everybody's calendar. That brings us to other business. Do any members of the committee have any other business they want to discuss today? All right. Hearing none, let's move on to public comment. Staff did not receive any comment written prior to today's meeting, and I don't see any comments in the chat box. Any other staff on the line? If I'm missing it, say so. Seeing nothing in the chat. If there's anyone today connected via telephone or listening in on the web, if you'd like to make a comment, please go ahead and unmute yourself and state your name. Looks like we have mostly staff folks on connected. So I don't see or hear any requests for public comment, so let the record reflect that there was no public comment. Which brings us to our next meeting date, which based on the action we just took, will be scheduled for February 9th, 2023. And with no other business, we'll look to adjourn the meeting. But before I ask for a motion to adjourn, I do just want to say on behalf of all of the staff at CMAP, thank you for attending today and throughout the year, and for, all of your thoughtful work throughout the year. And, please do have a healthy, safe, and happy holiday season, and we'll see you next year. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Rockingham.
Thank you, Mayor.
Gallagher seconds.
Thank you, President Gallagher. All in favor of adjourning this meeting?
Aye.
Aye.
Is there anybody opposed to adjourning our meeting? All right, with all in favor via voice vote, this meeting is now adjourned at 10:16 a.m. So thank you again, everyone.
Happy holidays,
Thank
everyone.
you.